Sometimes I lecture on preaching once in a while. And one of the things that I get going on is men that overuse inner-directed stories about themselves and about how they're feeling. One of the things that I learned is that if I want to get my congregation quiet, I can be preaching about anything, and then I'd say, I had a little experience this last week, and this is how I felt, and everything gets quiet. The children stop crying. They want to hear what's going on. It's a very enticing thing to do that kind of thing in your preaching. I'm building up to something in this, but it is enticing to do that kind of thing. And what else could I say about it? I could say that if you take an inner-directed story and you mix it with humor, so you've got the story, you've got the humor, you can have people eating out of your hand. Better than that, if I tell them about my dog, they'll really be into it. I had a golden retriever dog, beautiful dog, had a great Christian name. His name was Sunday. He weighed about 100 pounds. He was a red golden retriever. I used to say I could put a coffee on his butt and he would hold it. I mean, this dog was awesome. And I used to run with him all the time. And when I come back in the door, it's like God had come home. Whatever you want me to do, Master, I'll do it. No matter what your day is, you got a dog like that, you can make it. I used to run with him and swim with him. This was years ago, and I took him out to the car to get in, and he couldn't get in. This big, healthy, golden retriever. So I took him down to the vet and walked out carrying his collar. A couple of hours later, case of raging leukemia. Now, I can tell that story in such a way that grown men will cry. And then I can have somebody tell me after the sermon, that was the greatest sermon you ever preached. And it was about my dog. Now, I say all of this to kind of build up. I'm going to share some inner-directed stories, so don't start throwing tomatoes at me when I do it. But part of it's a method, because we're all pastors, and these are pastor stories, so that we can connect to them over this text, this inspired text where the Apostle Paul bears his heart and talks about the pressures that he had. So our text, as was beautifully read today, begins in my mind with this. Clay jars were the throwaway containers of the ancient world, so that their span was just a few years at the most. They were used for everything, for carrying water, wine, to hiding family treasures. And as such, they were an anonymous part of everyday existence. Everyone had clay pots in their house for drinking, storing leftovers, or whatever else. And that every archaeological dig in that part of the country has what we call, as you know, ostraca, which is pottery, broken pieces of pottery. I mean, it is everywhere. The disposable clay jars. No one took note of clay jars any more than they took note of a discarded paper cup. They were simply there. There was no tragedy if they were misplaced or broken. They were cheap. And so ubiquitous were jars of clay and broken jars of clay that provided the apostle with a perfect metaphor for the frail humanity of every believer who has ever lived. It is our metaphor for us. Indeed, the first man, Adam, was a man of clay formed out of the dust of the ground, and to dust he returned, his mortality. And so, as clay jars, we are all of us, fragile, transitory mortals, dust, utterly weak. I'm very aware of that the older I get. I mean, I'm going to be dust soon, which is a good thought, really. With this in mind, Paul's famous declaration pulses with meaning, which you all know. Verse 7, but we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. And that treasure is a saving power of the gospel that was, in fact, one and the same, and you read it in the context, with a creational power when they came to Christ, and as described in the preceding verse 6. For God, who let light shine out of darkness, has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. So this treasure, this creational, transforming gospel power of the new covenant has been committed to insignificant, fragile people of dust, to us. And if we regard ourselves, we're made in the imago Dei, don't get me wrong, but if we regard our bodies and our existence any more than dust, we are deluded. Now, those bodies are going to be resurrected, but yes. Now, the reason for this is there would be no mistake about where the power comes from. And so he's very clear as you look at the text to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. Now, that is not some humble, self-effacing acknowledgement of Paul's and our limitations as compared with the grace and of God. It is Christian realism, total realism. Our utterly frailty and weakness provide the ground for God's power. And we looked at it yesterday, but we need to lay our eyes on it again. At the very end of this letter, Paul rejoiced that his weaknesses made him a conduit for God's power. But he said to me, that's Jesus speaking, Dominical, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. So, here in chapter 4, the breaking of our clay vessels through the crushing circumstances of life invites the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ to shine forth with radiating power. In all of this, then, Paul is graphically and categorically stating that our weakness is essential to the display of his surpassing power. That's a huge thesis, and we'll flesh it out in a little bit, and we talked about it yesterday, but that statement is stunning. Our weakness is essential to the display of his surpassing power. I might say it right here. Do you believe that? Amen. Or I could say, do you believe that you believe it? Or just simply believe that you believe that you believe it. Little sophistry there, but you understand what I'm saying, where you really do believe this. So we go on from weakness to weakness, which then is to become ongoing vessels of power, ever weak, ever strong. Someone is alleged to have asked St. Francis, notice I put alleged down, how he was able to accomplish so much. He replied, this may be why. The Lord looked down from heaven and said, where can I find the weakest, littlest man on earth? Then he saw me, and he said, I found him, and he won't be proud of it. He'll see that I am only using him because of his insignificance. Now, whether that is a true story or not, you hear something like that, it is true in the sense of being eternal truth, cosmically true. Weakness as a way of life is the way of surpassing power. That is new covenant power, as was read in our text this morning. Now, in verses 8 and 9, Paul the Apostle invokes 4 parallel, pulsing paradoxes that illustrate Paul's experience of the axiom and power in his storied life. And hear this. The paradoxes are implicitly autobiographical, as Paul describes his ongoing, unrelenting life experience. But at the same time, we want to hear this, that each of the paradoxes finds resonance in the biography of every committed Christian here. They'll find echoes in your heart. And each of those paradoxes is, as I read years ago, is lapidary. In its polish and balance, it follows the same pattern, hinging on the identical emphatic imperative. And you see in those things, but not, but not, but not, but not. And each of the four paradoxes bring then an ascending intensity of weakness matched by an ascendant intensification of power. They're amazing statements. G.K. Chesterton once defined a paradox, maybe you know this, is truth standing on its head, shouting for attention. That's a great word from a good first-class mind. And that is what they do. We are afflicted in every way, it begins, but not crushed. Now, afflicted in every way encompasses Paul's mind-boggling account of the multiple afflictions, the repeated beatings, the shipwrecks, the floggings, the unrelenting dangers listed in chapter 11, and significantly, that word afflicted, and if you got your Greek, you can take a look at it, has a literal sense of being pressed together or compressed or squeezed. And that is what his storied life was. It was an ongoing pressure cooker, ongoing compressions. Now, I noted it yesterday. Interestingly, we find the first paradox also points to a specific event in Paul's ministry, recorded right here in 2 Corinthians in the opening chapter, verses 8 and 9. And I alluded to it yesterday, but I'll read it. For we do not want you to be unaware, brothers, of the affliction, or I could say, or the pressure, or the compression we experienced in Asia. For we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. That phrase, utterly burdened, was used variously in literature. One is to describe a ship that was so loaded down to its gunwales that it was sinking. In another place, it's used about a donkey that is so weighted down that he falls under the load, his legs splayed in despair, so he cannot rise. And Paul is saying by this language that he was so utterly, unbearably crushed by the circumstances that he couldn't get up. It's as if he wore a leaden cape. This is the sense of the language you have here. So the compression so crushed him, and he says that he despaired of life itself. This is possible. This is a guy that was beaten 5 times with 39 stripes. I cannot imagine 1 stripe. And he says, on this place, he thought he'd receive the sentence of death. So it was an awful experience for Paul. Well, there was a purpose in the Paul's crushing affliction, and he provides the simple explanation. 9b, but that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. And we don't know how it happened for Paul, but amidst the compressed misery of his being afflicted in every way, amidst the abject weakness, amidst death that was accompanying him, Paul cast himself completely on God, and guess what he experienced? In the text here, it's resurrection power. That's what he says. His crushing afflictions did not crush him, clay pot that he was. So, the first paradox of power for us earthen vessels is we are afflicted in every way, but not crushed. Now, I had a professor of Greek at Wheaton College when I taught there, and he studied under Merle Tenney, was the first Wheaton prof to get a PhD at Harvard. And he gave me these unpublished translations. And so the way Tenney put this, we are afflicted in every way but not crushed. He says, squeezed but not squashed. I love that. Now, for a moment now, consider this truth in relation to our lives. And I want to say, none of us want to arrogate ourselves to the level of the Apostle Paul and his unparalleled level of affliction, dire straits. That's not what we're doing in making this comparison. He is way beyond us. Nevertheless, the application applies to pastoral ministry because at the conclusion of the Litany of Sufferings in chapter 11, and you should look at this closely, chapter 11, 28 and 29, he says, apart from other things, there is a daily pressure of my anxiety for all the churches. Who is weak, and I'm not weak? Who is made to fall, and I am not indignant? He says this at the end of a litany of abuses that I cannot adequately describe. So Paul, in effect, tops up his unparalleled list of sufferings with a poignant reference to his pressured pastoral anxieties. And here's what you want to hear, pastors. Now, I may be wrong here, but it seems to me he's saying that his pastoral pains pained him most of all. I mean, he says apart from other things, then he lays this on. Isn't that amazing? His pastoral anxieties and pains. Some years ago when I was pastoring in the Midwest, my wife was taking her turn in driving the carpool to school. And Gigi, one of the neighbor's children, asked, "What does Mr. Hughes do?" And Barbara answered, "You know Gigi. He's pastor of College Church." And Gigi replied, "I know. But what does he do the rest of the week?" and we've heard all the tired humor, haven't we, from people that say you work one day a week and all that sort of thing. It must be just great to work one day a week. The truth is, there is a compression that is endemic to the pastoral ministry of which many congregants haven't the slightest inkling. They don't know. They think they know, and they don't know. Now, personally, if I included Sunday as a work day, and I don't know how, I know what the Westminster Confession says, but I tell you what, I preached 3 times on Sunday morning and once in the evening for years. That was a work day. If I did that, I regularly worked about 60 hours a week over my 40-plus years of pastoral ministry. And you know the weekly routine, 15 to 20 hours a week when you're doing nothing except sitting behind a desk, sweating over Sunday's text to feed the flock. That's all you're doing. And then there's and I heard it today, the elders' meetings. I heard presbytery, counseling sessions, personal discipleship, prayer meetings, hospital visitations, special services, and of course, time-consuming pastoralia, like a wedding. That'll eat your whole life up. Funerals, missions conferences, emergencies. You know, a death of a precious saint on Friday night. And lastly and foremost and beautifully, family. And all of this mixed and stirred well with proper Pauline anxiety leads to this: who is weak and I'm not weak? Who is made to fall and I'm not indignant? Ministerial compressions. I'm talking about them. I hope you're relating to this. How to make it. How to be squeezed but not squashed. I was just told a couple of weeks ago, and I was at David Pallison's funeral that was Well, it wasn't his funeral. It's where he couldn't come to graduation because he was so weak as he was dying. And so Powison sent a letter. And it was very significant what Powison said. But he hung everything on the singular in Romans 8:26, where it begins, let me get it straight now. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. For when we do not know what to pray for as ought, the Holy Spirit prays for us according to the will of God. But notice it's singular weakness. And as he was dying, he said, we are all weak. It's not a matter of weaknesses. It is a matter of being weak. And he hung it on Romans 8:26. By bracing our clay pot weakness, we cannot do it unless we understand our feet are clay and then cast ourselves completely upon Christ and his resurrection power. God is looking for a good few weak men. And ladies, I mean you too, you know that. So, he's bewildered but not befuddled, squeezed but not squashed, bewildered but not befuddled. Now, Paul doesn't name his perplexities, but it's fair to assume that the bewildering diverse array of his sufferings puzzled him at times. I mean, we can see these perplexing situations over the course of Paul's life. I mean, you see him. And thank the Lord, he's not Job with Job's knowledge. He knows what is going on. But listen to this. The sharp conflict that arose between Paul and Barnabas when Paul rejected the company of John Mark. And then Barnabas, with John Mark in tow, took off while Silas remained with Paul. And the effect for the apostle was a bewildering separation of true great followers of Christ. Acts 15. You look at the 16th chapter, and then immediately following the painful separation, Paul and his company suffered bewilderment amidst their futile attempts to go into Asia because the Spirit was funneling, it wouldn't let them go into Asia. It was trying to go into Asia. It kept funneling him all the way down to Troas, right? And then Paul experienced the perplexing desertion of once trusted friends like Demas that haunted him to the very end of his ministry. And when he talks about we fought the good fight and so on, he remembers Demas. Isn't that amazing? And then we have the background for Paul's writing 2 Corinthians, which is the Corinthians' baffling rejection of him. This is the church's founding apostle by certain leaders in the Corinthian church because he lacked the desired looks, the desired clothing, the sartorial elegance that they wanted, and his posture, and his lack of elan. And the prissy studied eloquence of the sophists. And it was. Such puzzling perplexities, but Paul never yielded to despair. Certainly he had head-scratching perplexities through his ministry, but he didn't give in to despair. Sometimes bewildered, but never befuddled. That was him. Now, perplexities are endemic to the ministry and especially the ministering heart. The wife of Verl Lindley, the pastor who led me to Christ, who, by the way, flew 28 missions in World War II. After he was shot down, after the 9th one, he went on for 20 more missions. You're talking about a guy, a man. And his wife enjoyed telling the story. This is Lois, my wife knows the story, that she awoke one night to find Verl asleep on his elbows and knees at the foot of the bed. Kind of weird, knees, so on, at the foot of the bed. And she said, being a very vocal woman, "Verl, what on earth are you doing?" "Shh," he answered, still asleep. "I'm holding a pyramid of marbles together, and if I move, it's going to tumble down." Classic pastor's dream. Because it's the subconscious revelation of a pressured parson, right? Second, because a pyramid of marbles is often an apt metaphor for a pastor's work. Some of you have a pyramid of marbles that you're holding together. Well, the pastor's inevitable and unavoidable knowledge of the perplexing forces at work as one's people is another thing that pressures him. Now listen, what you know, pastors and wives, the conflicts among members, the individual sins of some, the hidden family problems, the dissatisfaction with your ministry, the lifestyle inconsistencies of the people, the different opinions of what the church should be, and awareness of criticisms and gossip about the pastor himself. I mean, that thing you make you feel like you got one wrong move and it's done. So to be an ideal pastor, and here I'm just kidding, sort of, is a pastor who lives above all these perplexities and calls on his members, but is never out of the office, is warm and friendly, but not too familiar, is humorous, but not funny, is an expository preacher, but always preaches on the family, and is profound, but comprehensible. Oh, man. The kind of things that can be expected, perplexing things. Perplexed, but not driven to despair. Following the wordplay, bewildered, but not befuddled. Why? Because we understand and embrace our weakness, that we are frail earthen vessels in the hands of the divine potter, and like the apostle, know that for those who love God, all things work together for good. We know that. We say it. We believe it. And we need not despair. The third paradox of power turns up the heat. Persecuted but not forsaken. You see it in the text there. The participle persecuted bears the sense of being persecuted or tracked down, and this is certainly was Paul's constant experience as he was tracked down and harassed across the cities of the Roman Empire by his own people, Israel. And he wasn't hard to find because he always went to the synagogue, right? He always did that when he entered a new city. He was always going to the Jews first. And he was then stripped and given over to a unique Jewish punishment of 40 lashes less one. The limitation of 39 lashes, stripes, meant to take him to the precipice of death without killing him. Nice. This is something I don't think you probably thought of. Paul endured this excruciating flogging, that 5 times in his ministry, it tells us. And likely more times because he continued his storied ministry for a decade more after writing Corinthians in AD 95 or 96. He had 10 more years of ministry after he had all of these floggings. And that doesn't include being hounded by the accursed Judaizing legalists who he fought bare knuckle all the way across Asia and Europe. And along with this, just to dramatize it, the danger motif, the grim lyrics echoed through all his travels. Danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger of false brothers. So that his missionary trail dripped with his own blood. But through it all, he says He was never forsaken. And he knew that he would never be forsaken. In fact, it's significant. We don't have to go into it here, but in the Acts, where there's a plot by 40 plus that are going to kill him, Jesus appears to him. Acts 23:11, and says, "Take courage, for you've testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify in Rome." And that theophany confirmed what Paul had always known. Though hounded and persecuted, heaven was at his side. So the paradox of power: persecuted but not forsaken. That coursed through his soul. Now, as to pastors, many of us have been hounded by people who want, I just misread my notes. Not many of us have been hounded by people who want to take our lives and spill our blood. Don't a Marxist context like Korea or a Muslim context that obtains today, and the grim possibility is rising in the secularist, woke, unforgiving hater culture of our universities. Now here, I'm going to allow myself another little story that is really tamed down of this thing. It's a domesticated, very personal, in-church application of Paul's battle with the legalists and Judaizers. During the early 70s, Barb and I planted a church in North Orange County, California, just north of Disneyland. Great spot. And it was just post-60s. And we soon had a thriving, heterogeneous little congregation of middle-class families, hippies, ex-hippies, business people, teachers, tradesmen. Most were very young. And among them, let me say, there were bright-eyed converts, young families who naturally evangelized, wanted to grow, always sharing Christ, and we loved them. But as the months passed, we noticed that their countenances, especially the men, began to change. Their ready smiles faded to, you know what a grieved countenance is? They were less spontaneous in conversation. Their wives began wearing long dresses. The men got rid of their beards and their mustaches because they were libidinous. Others were recruited to their pathology. They accused me of dressing nicely to attract women. On one occasion, one of the men reached over and grabbed the back of my collar and said, with kind of a sneer and a smile, "Dacron and polyester, mixed fibers." Well, I knew Leviticus 19:18 about the law, but I didn't know the next verse, which forbid mixed fibers. And I could go on, but you can imagine the harried existence and the hurt we experienced of these boneheaded legalists and the casualties that fell along the wayside. But we were persecuted but not forsaken, pursued but not abandoned, which is a wonderful story in itself. And that little book that's a freebie that we brought along with tells the story of what happened there if you want to read it. Really an amazing thing. So the earthen vessel paradoxes mount up, declaring that weakness is a sacred ground of power. Squeezed but not squashed, bewildered but not befuddled, persecuted but not abandoned. And the mounting intensity of the paradoxes peaks in the final expression: struck down but not destroyed. Struck down means to be struck down by a weapon, whacked, so to speak. And Paul was whacked. And he alludes to his experience of being struck down in his litany, saying, "Once I was stoned." Paul was hunted down and stoned. A ghastly event in which the coup de grace is a brick or a boulder to the head. He bore in his body the marks of Jesus. I don't know where they were, but might have been there. And this was capped by his beaten body being dragged out to the city to rot unburied ignominy. And so his body lay with fresh, bleeding marks of Jesus. Now, this is my imagination, so don't say the Bible says this, okay? But to the astonishment of his grieving disciples, he popped open an eye. My imagination at work, and he said, Men, we've got to get out of here. To which they all gave eager assent, not expecting that he would lead them right back into Lystra, which he did. Acts 14, 19, and 20. It'd be hard to be on the trail with Paul. Paul was literally struck down, but not that powerful adversity, destroyed at Lystra. Knocked down, but not knocked out. The facts are he was whacked, he was struck down. This happened other times, not with a club, but with intimate personal blows and disappointments, perhaps even more stunning than his stoning. Have you been whacked? Unexpectedly whacked? And amidst a dark night of the soul, the legalist had finally got to me in my church. I was young, still in my 30s, and I had some help from my own pride and concealed arrogance and inexperience and naivety. But amidst a dark night of soul, I poured out my heart to Barbara. And she wrote this down. You know, you don't want an amanuensis that writes down everything that you say, but she did. And I said to her, God has called me to do something that he hasn't given me the gifts to accomplish. Therefore, God is not good. That's almost Jobian in its ignorance and arrogance, isn't it? I knew I'd been called by God. I'd never been able to escape the call. I'd been since I was a teenager. It's all that I'd wanted to do, and now I felt I was the butt of a cruel joke. I was a failure. I wanted to quit. In aching desperation, I said to my wife, what am I going to do? Well, how distressing it was for my wife. I'd always been the one whom she could depend upon, kind of together, you know, and I was faltering. Actually, I was whacked. I was knocked down. But as it worked out, not knocked out because of the Lord and my wife. And I will never forget the confident response. This is another quotation. This is all written down. She said, I don't know what you're going to do, but for now, for tonight, hang on to my faith, because I believe. I believe God is good. I believe that he loves us and is going to work through this experience. So hang on to my faith. This is the great line. I have enough for both of us. And then her hero went off to bed, leaving her to meditate these things. And the story is quite a story, which you can read about. But we weren't left lying on the canvas. In fact, it was the beginning, the genesis of coming to grips with what biblical success is. That's where we learned it. So if you have the paradoxes, they're now standing on, their four paradoxes are now standing on their head. Their legs are up in the air, treading air, shouting for attention. Look at me. Ponder. Hey, you. Think about it. Absorb. And then live out your ministry to the glory of God. And you can feel the rising intensity of these Pauline paradoxes by stacking the humiliations that Paul endured in his fragile earthen vessel of his body. He was squeezed, pressured, bewildered, pursued, knocked down, abject weakness. But then you have God's surpassing power, not squashed, not befuddled, not abandoned, not knocked out. So what an amazing power clay pots have. Why is this? Again, Paul's opening statement. We have this treasure in jars of clay to show that surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. That's what it's about. The great apostle's weakness, and this is true, was the occasion and condition for the working out of God's power. And the apostle Paul remained an earthen vessel, a fragile clay pot to the very end, as his crumbling flesh invited the power of God to shine so brightly. So the paradox is all shout to the glory of God. Now, we're not that much more, so as Paul deepens this point, he goes on to inform the Corinthians that experience of power through weakness was, in effect, like that of Jesus in his death. And so I want you to listen closely. In his death, I'll say, read abject weakness. And then in Jesus' resurrection, read cosmic power. And Paul sums up how this paradoxical experience of weakness gave birth to power with a radically Christ-focused statement. And you need to pay attention to this because I don't think it shows in your New Testaments. Always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies. Now, what you need to do to catch what is being said here is the word that's rendered death is not thanatos, it's tein nekrosin, the killing of Jesus. It's very, very intentional. Rather than the final state of death, C.K. Barrett explains, quote, Paul's meaning is that one or a person who observed his life would see constantly repeated a process analogous to the killing of Jesus. Sounds kind of macabre, doesn't it? That's what he says. That's the word. So he bore in his body the dying, the killing of Jesus. He lived out his missionary calling. Now, we know this from Galatians 6:17. He would include his letter to the Galatians saying, from now on, let no one cause me trouble, for I bear in my body the marks of Jesus. And he got the marks of Jesus during the humiliating deaths and sufferings when he was squeezed and bewildered and persecuted and knocked down. And indeed, Jesus, by virtue of his oneness with Paul, shared in those paradoxical sufferings of the apostle. He could say to them, why are you persecuting me as they persecuted them? Though bearing in his body the killing of Jesus was central to Paul's experience of ministry of the new covenant, it was not an end in itself. Bearing the death, the killing of Jesus was also intended to bring life, as the last half of verse 10 explains. The killing of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies. So those who observed Paul saw the life of Jesus manifested in amazing power and resilience that was displayed in and through Paul's earthen vessel over the course of his epic life as he endured, in John Calvin's words, we quoted early, enough difficulty to break 1,000 hearts while riding those wild, bucking paradoxes from weakness to power. In the same way, the life of Jesus is manifested on our mortal bodies when we embrace his dying as our way to live and look to him as we ride the four paradoxes from weakness to power, while all the while holding close the vibrating truth. We have this treasure in jars of clay to show that surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. I'll just stop right there. Everything that Paul experienced was at the hand of Satan. He had his thorn, but then all of these pummelings came from the hand of Satan. And then you get a surprise. By the way Paul has been structuring his thought, we would expect him to conclude with something like, so death is at work in us, but life brims, overflows in us. But surprise! He says, so death is at work in us, but life in you. That is the great principle of the cross, isn't it? Christ died that we might live. And those most used to spread the good news of Christ embrace death as the operational principle for ministry. I think about this man. Paul's bruised and bloody trails circling the Mediterranean would not have happened if he rejected the principle. The naughty Corinthian church that Paul is writing to would not have existed if death had not been at work in Paul. So it's the cross. Now, I don't want to be overly dramatic with all of this, but you can see the principles repeated through the text here, that Paul is making a point. So we see the cross of Christ crowns this brief section as he tells how the ministry of the new covenant works again. We have this treasure in jars of clay to show the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. Paradoxes each move from weakness to power, from death to life. When we embrace our weaknesses, we die to depending upon our seeming strengths, however we may fancy them, whether they be of the mind or of the personality or looks or talents or wealth or education or heritage or accomplishments or fame. So the question that I just want to put out there is very simple. Have we died to our putative strengths? We must. And rely upon Jesus. I told you my favorite quotations from Oswald Chambers, and I carry it around with me. God can achieve his purpose either through the abandonment of human power and resources or the abandonment of reliance upon them. All through history, God has chosen and used nobodies because of their unusual dependence upon him, made possible the unique display of his power and grace. He chose and used somebodies only when they renounced dependence on their natural abilities and resources. And I'll just say it's the same question. Do you believe this? I mean, you don't have to answer out loud, but do you believe it? Well, if you really believe this, our lives are going to be redolent with the power of the gospel. And may that be so. Amen.